Hello everyone, welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 160, and it's titled We Are Castaways, Ahoy There. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or working with suggested cards from our viewers, building this deck on a budget of $100 or less, and specifically building the deck around a theme of the chosen card, specifically for Commander in Magic the Gathering. So with that being said, let's take a look at our random card of the week, and this week it's going to be Jace, Cunning Castaway. So Jace is 1 blue for a 3 loyalty legendary planeswalker, Jace. He's got a +1 ability. Whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player this turn, draw a card, then discard a card. -2, create a 2/2 blue illusion creature token with, when this creature becomes the target of a spell, sacrifice it. And -5, create 2 tokens that are copies of Jace, Cunning Castaway, except they're not legendary. So there's quite a bit going on with this card, but you might notice that it doesn't do too much on its own, and honestly, even if we get multiple copies of it by activating that -5, it still doesn't do that much. The best we can really do is make a bunch of 2/2 illusions, but there are ways that we can kind of take advantage of the fact that this is a -5 ability, and we'll talk about some of those ways that we can do that later. But first, we of course got to talk about our commander for this deck, and I wasn't originally sure who I wanted the commander to be, but I knew I wanted to add a couple of colors to it, and in the end I decided to just add all of the colors to it. So this week we have a 5-color deck, and our commander is another planeswalker in Jared Carthalion. So Jared Carthalion is a white, blue, black, red, green, 5 loyalty legendary planeswalker Jared. +1, create a 3/3 Kavu creature token with trample that's all colors. -3, choose up to 2 target creatures. For each of them, put a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of colors it is. And -6, return target multicolored card from your graveyard to your hand. If that card was all colors, draw a card and create 2 treasure tokens. And of course, Jared Carthalion can be your commander. Now, you might be wondering why exactly Jared is our commander for this deck, because it really doesn't seem to do anything with Jace. It doesn't care about the illusions that Jace makes. It doesn't really care about the card draw or the tokens. And then Jace doesn't care about the Kavus. It's not all creature types. It's not even multicolored. So they don't really interact that much at all. However, as we move into our themes for this deck and we talk about our first theme, you'll start to realize why they're connected. And that is, of course, we are playing a Superfriends deck. We are playing as many planeswalkers as we can to try to take advantage of Jared's abilities, but also Jace's abilities. Ideally, and this is going to sound a little bit strange, we kind of want Jace to look like the most unassuming planeswalker in play. We want every other planeswalker we play to be a much bigger threat than Jace, because we do want to take advantage of his -5 ability, and we want to find ways to do that as much as possible. So a great example of what we can do with our planeswalkers comes from Commodore Guff here, which is 1 blue, red, white for a 5 loyalty legendary planeswalker Guff. At the beginning of your end step, put a loyalty counter on another target planeswalker you control. +1, create a 1/1 red wizard creature token with tap, add a red, spend this mana only to cast a planeswalker spell, and -3, you draw X cards and Commander Guff deals X damage to each opponent, where X is the number of planeswalkers you control, and Commodore Guff can be your commander. That's not particularly relevant for us, but that is something to note. So we want to take advantage of having as many planeswalkers as possible. We want to be activating them as many times as we can. And of course, since we have that many planeswalkers in play, or at least we're hoping to have that many planeswalkers in play, that leads us to our next theme, because we want to be protecting those planeswalkers. And there aren't a ton of ways to do that. A lot of the cards like Ghostly Prison or Propaganda specify that our opponents have to pay to attack us, but not our planeswalkers. So we had to dig deep and find some cards that care about protecting planeswalkers, like, for example, Nil's Discipline Enforcer, which is 2 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature human cleric. At the beginning of your end step, for each player, put a +1/+1 counter on up to one target creature that player controls, and each creature with one or more counters on it can't attack you or, and this is the most important part, planeswalkers you control unless its controller pays X, where X is the number of counters on that creature. So if we play Nils and then move to our end step, we can just put one +1/+1 counter on one creature that each player controls, including ourselves. So we could make Nils a little bit bigger, or maybe some of our other creatures a little bit bigger. But the most important part of this is that now, as soon as there's any counters on our opponent's creatures, they have to pay to attack us, and it doesn't specify +1/+1 counters. So if it's +1/+1 counters, if it's charge counters, if it's oil counters, it doesn't matter. Any counters our opponents now have to pay. And if they're paying to attack our planeswalkers, we're most likely going to get into a situation where it's just more efficient for our opponents to attack someone else, and they're able to leave us alone. Even if it's not for a very long period of time, it's typically long enough for it to make a difference and for us to really build up our board and do what we want to be doing. And then finally, of course, we're going to move into our final theme of the deck, which is going to be gates. And I know this one sounds a little bit weird when we're talking about Superfriends, but one of the biggest struggles that I often have with our 5-color decks are the mana bases. Having to build a budget 5-color mana base is incredibly difficult, and one of the most efficient ways that I have found to do that recently is with gates. Being able to play a ton of gates means that we have access to most of our colors, but that also means that we get to play some unique cards that synergize well with gates and are just kind of value engines on their own, and Guild Summit is a great example of that because it is 2 and a blue for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you may tap any number of untapped gates you control, then draw a card for each gate tapped this way, and finally, whenever a gate enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So being able to draw cards just from playing our lands means that we really never run out of things to do, and there's plenty of ways to guarantee that our gates come into play untapped. There's ways to make sure that our gates are providing pretty much any color of mana that we want, and then of course there's also the ability to use those gates to wipe the board or to ramp or whatever else it may be. So the gates are a great way to make the 5-color mana base function. And then I figured since we have the gates, we may as well play some support pieces as well, just to get a little extra value. So those are all of our themes for this week. And the next thing we got to do is take a look at some key cards. And these are the cards that, while sometimes they may be win conditions, they're more often just going to be value pieces and just important parts of the deck in general. So the first card that I want to highlight is going to be Carth the Lion. And Carth the Lion looks a little bit strange at first, and it's worded kind of weird, so bear with me, but it is incredibly powerful in this deck. Carth is 2 black-green for a 3/5 legendary creature human warrior. Whenever Carth the Lion enters the battlefield or a planeswalker you control dies, look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal a planeswalker from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom in a random order. Now, even if it was just that ability, Carth is already going to be doing exactly what we want by letting us dig for our planeswalkers. But the most important ability on Carth is that the second line of text says Planeswalker's loyalty abilities you activate cost an additional +1 to activate. And this is an incredibly strange way to word this, and it works very oddly in game. But it essentially means that every time we activate the plus ability of a Planeswalker, we're getting an additional loyalty counter. But at the same time, we can now activate the minus abilities of our Planeswalkers even if they don't have all those loyalty counters available, because it's an extra 1 to activate it. So for example, if we have a planeswalker that ultimates at 5 and it's only at 4, we can actually activate the -5 ability because it's going to cost us an additional 1. And so you can kind of get the sense that that is important for a multitude of reasons, but there's a very specific reason I chose 5, and that is because Jace Cunning Castaway now, instead of having to plus twice and then -5, can just plus once and -5 the next turn. So if we can find any way to give Jace just one more loyalty counter, we can then activate his -5 ability immediately with Carth in play and make 2 Jaces, both of which can then also activate their -5 immediately, and we can technically make an infinite number of Jaces, which can then make an infinite number of illusion tokens. And yes, that doesn't automatically win us the game. We would still need to attack or do something else with it, but it's still relevant because it's infinite, right? So any amount of infinite anything is usually worth taking a look at. But anyway, I think that's enough about Carth the Lion. And the next card that I want to take a look at is Vraska Betrayal's Sting. So Vraska is very similar in the sense that she also is going to be benefiting our planeswalkers, but she is going to be doing it in a very different way than Carth. So first off, let's read through her cards. So she is Vraska Betrayal's Sting, 4 black and a Phyrexian black for a 6 loyalty legendary planeswalker Vraska. She's completed, so we can pay the Phyrexian black with either a black mana or 2 life, but if we pay with life, she enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters. We can 0, draw a card, and lose 1 life, then proliferate. -2, target creature becomes a treasure artifact with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color, and loses all other card types and abilities. And -9, if target player has fewer than 9 poison counters, they get a number of poison counters equal to the difference. So Vraska really does everything we want to do, but most importantly is her 0 ability. Being able to proliferate is incredibly powerful because that just adds an extra loyalty counter to all of our planeswalkers, and there's really nothing that our opponents can do to stop that. Plus, if we do somehow magically get to her -9 ability and put someone to 9 poison counters, then we can just proliferate and put that person to 10 poison counters and knock them out of the game. So she really does everything. She draws cards, she proliferates, she's removal, she's a win condition, and you really can't hype up Vraska enough. Because if she's in play, the rest of your super friends and the rest of your planeswalkers are really just supercharged by being able to proliferate and add an extra counter to them every single turn. But we gotta talk about our last key card, and this is the main reason that I wanted to build this deck, because I saw Jace and I was trying to think of ways that we could really make his ultimate ability work, that -5. What could we really do with it? And that led me to Nicol-Bolas Dragon God. Now, I know this is not a brand new combo. I know this is pretty well known at this point, but it's still worth highlighting because this was the main thing I wanted to do with this deck. So to explain what this means, Nicol-Bolas Dragon God is blue, black, 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 red for a 4 loyalty legendary planeswalker Bolas. Nicol-Bolas Dragon God has all loyalty abilities of all other planeswalkers on the battlefield. +1, you draw a card. Each opponent exiles a card from their hand or a permanent they control. -3, destroy target creature or planeswalker. And -8, each opponent who doesn't control a legendary creature or planeswalker loses the game. Now, obviously this is a win condition with its -8. It's going to be very unlikely that we actually get to that point, because even if we can -8, since this is Commander and everyone's deck is built around a legendary creature or planeswalker, it's going to be very difficult to actually get that to, let us win the game. But the reason that we really wanted this with Jace is because Nicol-Bolas has all loyalty abilities of other planeswalkers on the battlefield, including Jace's -5. So if we have Carth the Lion, Jace Cunning Castaway, and Nicol-Bolas Dragon God, we can actually -5 Nicol-Bolas immediately because it costs 1 plus additional loyalty counters to make 2 non-legendary copies of Nicol-Bolas Dragon God. And if we're doing that, we can then continue that cycle to make an infinite number of Nicol-Bolas Dragon Gods, which, unlike an infinite number of Jaces, actually straight up wins the game, because we get to essentially destroy everything that's in play. We get to +1 draw a card. We can draw our entire deck, make each opponent exile a card from their hand or a permanent they control, meaning that they no longer have any permanents in play, they no longer have any hands, and we can just kind of stop once we've hit that point. We can destroy their creatures and planeswalkers, we can work the other ones up to get to that -8, and since we can activate all of those Nicol-Bolases every single turn, wiping away our opponent's permanents, wiping away their hand, there is really nothing they're going to be able to do to stop us, because even if they top deck a land and play a land, we just plus Nicol-Bolas, exile the land, and then we keep going. So once we've made infinite Nicol-Bolases, it's just over for our opponents. There's really nothing they can do to get their way back into the game, because they would need to top deck both removal and lands, which is just not going to happen. So that is why it's definitely our key card here, and it is the main reason that I wanted to push this deck into 5 colors and push the Planeswalker synergies, because I wanted to pull off some shenanigans like that. But anyway, those are all of our key cards, so I think the next piece of our deck tech we gotta talk about is, of course, the cool interactions. These are the cards that synergize super well together, and in some cases are win conditions on their own, but more often are just value engines and kind of just cards I think are cool, because why not? So the first set of cards that I would like to talk about for our cool interactions is going to be Heart of Kiran and Dahada, Binder of Wills. So Heart of Kiran is a personal favorite card of mine. It is 2 mana for a 4/4 legendary artifact vehicle, has flying and vigilance, crew 3, but you may remove a loyalty counter from a planeswalker you control rather than pay Heart of Kiran's crew cost. And what better to remove a counter from than Dahada, Binder of Wills, which is 1 red, white, black for a legendary planeswalker Dahada. She comes in with 5 loyalty. She can +2 up to 1 target legendary creature, gains vigilance, lifelink, and indestructible until your next turn. -3, reveal the top 4 cards of your library, put any number of legendary cards from among them into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. Create a treasure for each card put into your graveyard this way. And -11, gain control of all non-land permanents until the end of turn. Untap them, they gain haste. So Dahada also works really well with our planeswalker abilities, because being able to -3 to just kind of dig for planeswalkers is very, very powerful. But the reason that I wanted to highlight it alongside Heart of Kiran is because we can actually remove a counter from Dahada. So if she comes in at 5, we put her to 4, crew the Heart of Kiran, and you'll notice it is a legendary artifact, which means that when it becomes a creature, it is now a legendary creature. So we can actually use Dahada's +2 ability to target the Heart of Kiran, give it vigilance, which it already has, so that's not a big deal, but also lifelink and indestructible, plus we put 2 loyalty counters on Dahada, but because we had to remove one for Heart of Kiran, it's just +1, but we're still in the positives here. We're gaining 4 life from Heart of Kiran. Our opponents are going to really struggle to block it because it's indestructible, and because it has vigilance, we can just remove a counter from Dahada again to crew it if we need to block, because it gets lifelink and indestructible until our next turn. It's not just a one and done on our turn, we can use it to block every single turn. So our opponents, even if they can swing into Dahada, or even if they can swing into us, they're probably not going to want to, because we now have a 4/4 flying, vigilance, lifelink, indestructible vehicle that we can crew at any time as long as we have a planeswalker in play. So that alone sets up a huge defense field for us and really prevents our opponents from getting through in combat, because they're just going to be gaining us life with the Heart of Kiran since it's indestructible and has lifelink. But before I go too much on about this cool interaction, because I'm a big fan of this, we got to talk about our next cool interaction, which is going to be between Deification and Gideon of the Trials. Now, this is a bit of a, I don't want to say pet card interaction of mine, but I am a huge fan of Gideon, and Deification works perfectly with Gideon of the Trials, so I had to highlight this combination of cards. But Deification is 1 and a white for an enchantment. As Deification enters the battlefield, choose a planeswalker type. In this case, we would choose Gideon. Planeswalkers you control of the chosen type have hexproof, and as long as you control a creature, if damage dealt to a planeswalker you control of the chosen type would result in all loyalty counters on it being removed, instead all but one of those counters are removed. Then, Gideon of the Trials is 1 white for a 3 loyalty legendary planeswalker Gideon, +1 until your next turn, prevent all damage target permanent would deal. 0 until end of turn, Gideon of the Trials becomes a 4/4 human soldier creature with indestructible that's still a planeswalker, prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. And the most important ability is his other 0. You get an emblem with as long as you control a Gideon planeswalker, you can't lose the game, and your opponents can't win the game. So the way that this works out in practice is if we have Gideon of the Trials, we can 0 get the emblem, we can no longer lose the game as long as we have Gideon in play. We can cast Deification, naming Gideon, to give him hexproof so that way he can't be the target of removal spells. And as long as we have any creature in play, any damage that would be dealt to Gideon is now reduced to 1 instead of taking him all the way out, meaning that he can never die, provided we have a creature and Deification, and since he can never die, we can never die because of his emblem. So obviously this is not 100% foolproof. They can remove Deification, someone can wipe away all the creatures, but it's a great way to put a little pressure on the board and make sure that they really have to deal with some pieces our opponents do, otherwise we're just going to sit there and not die. And because this works out so well, we can actually just kind of let our opponents attack us. We don't have to block. We can go to 0 life or even more because we can't die with the Gideon of the Trials emblem, and our opponents can't kill Gideon because of the Deification. Now, again, this is pretty fragile. If someone destroys the Deification, they can then kill the Gideon, which can then kill us. Or if they kill all of our creatures, then Gideon will no longer go to 1 loyalty, but will die, and then will die. So this can be disrupted, but I do think this is a super fun synergy, and it's something I did want to highlight because, once again, I love Gideon. Gideon is by far my favorite planeswalker, and then Deification is just a neat card that I really like to include when I can. I've even tried building a Pioneer deck around this synergy, so obviously you can tell I'm a little all in on that. But those are our cool interactions for this week. So let's get into one of the final parts of our deck tech, which is the price of our deck. And this week, our price of the deck came in to $94.50, so we got pretty close to the budget limit. And the most expensive card in the deck isn't even a planeswalker, it's a support piece in Pure Imaginative Rascal. So Pier is 2 and a green for a 1/1 legendary creature human. He partners with Toothy, imaginary friend, and if 1 or more counters would be put on a permanent your team controls, that many plus 1 of each of those kinds of counters are put on those permanents instead. The reason that Pier is so expensive is because he cares about all kinds of counters. Most effects like this, like Hardened Scales, only care about +1/+1 counters, but because Pier specifies any kinds of counters, that means our planeswalkers also benefit from Pier's ability. Now, that doesn't mean that this should be an auto include in the deck because it is quite expensive. And to be perfectly honest, even though we have Pier, we are including Toothy just because he's, his partner. We can search it up with Pier. It's like 2 copies of Pier. But if we take a look at both of their prices, Toothy is also pretty expensive at $7.63. So it's not exactly where we want to be with the deck because we want to make sure that we can spend that money on our planeswalkers and other things like that. So putting both of these cards in adds about $15 to the budget. So if you did want to trim and maybe add some more powerful and more expensive planeswalkers, you could cut these 2. But I do think they're worth it if you do want a little bit of support. But like I said, they're not necessary to the deck, and we have tons of other ways that we can help support them and their synergies. Now, on the other hand, though, if we're talking about cards that are too expensive for the deck, I do have one card that I would love to include in this deck, but I didn't have the budget for it. And since, of course, we're talking about a card that we would put in, we got to talk about a card that we would take out. So first off, the card that we would put in would be Ripples of Potential, and the card that I would recommend taking out is Gatewatch Beacon. So starting off with Ripples of Potential, this is 1 in a blue for an instant that says Proliferate, then choose any number of permanents you control that had a counter put on them this way. Those permanents phase out. This is by far one of the best protection spells that we could get for our planeswalkers, because not only is it 2 mana at instant speed, it proliferates, which buffs up all of our planeswalkers, and then those permanents phase out. They cannot be attacked, they cannot be destroyed, they cannot be exiled, they are just gone for the foreseeable future, meaning that we are guaranteed to get them back at the start of our turn. So Ripples of Potential is an amazingly powerful card, and I put it in a deck just a couple weeks ago, and it was only about $6 to $7 at that time, so it is very quickly climbing in price. So if you are interested in Ripples of Potential, I would pay attention to it, because every time I look at it, the card's price is going up, and it is a phenomenal card for a whole bunch of different strategies. Now, like I mentioned though, if we are putting in Ripples of Potential, we do have to take a card out of the deck, and the card I would recommend taking out is Gatewatch Beacon, which is 2 and a white for an artifact. It enters the battlefield with 3 loyalty counters on it. You can tap it to add a white mana, and whenever a planeswalker enters the battlefield under your control, if Gatewatch Beacon has loyalty counters on it, you may remove a loyalty counter from Gatewatch Beacon onto that planeswalker. So originally, when I put this in, I was thinking, oh, it's a 3 mana rock, plus it gets extra loyalty for a lot of our planeswalkers. But after testing it a couple of times, it just never quite feels good enough. The issue of it adding just white mana in a 5-color deck is less than ideal, and because it only gets 3 loyalty counters on it, we actually run out of them very quickly in this deck. And yes, we can choose not to move a loyalty counter so we can save them for our important spells, but that's really not what we want to be doing, and we do have Proliferate, so we could proliferate it, but I often found that we ran out of it faster than we could add them to it, so it really didn't do what I wanted it to do, and it just felt kind of clunky. I do think that there are decks that this could work, maybe if it's a mono white or Boros or even Jeskai planeswalker deck. I think it could do very well, but I don't think 5-color is where we want to have it. So if you have the budget, I would recommend swapping it out for Ripples of Potential, but if you don't, then obviously it's still going to be okay. It's just not the best in this deck. So with that being said though, before we jump into a game with this deck, because of course we got to get a game with it, we've got to see how this deck performs in action, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. As always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. Please do, I really appreciate it. But if you would like to support us a little bit more, you can follow us over on Twitter, over on Reddit, you can send us an email, and you can also find us on Patreon and right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you get a ton of amazing benefits like the deck lists a week early. I'm trying to also highlight some of those on YouTube now as well, so if you see some posts from me talking about the decks for next week, that is also something we're doing, but you don't get the official list unless you're a channel member or a patron. You also get access to a Discord where we brew up a lot of the videos and we actually play the games that are in the videos. So you can help us build the decks, you can help play against the decks, you can show up on the channel. You get cards sent to you every week. You get the unedited gameplay videos. And I should correct myself. I said you get a card every week. It's not a card every week. It's a card every month. That is a random card of the week. That was my mistake there. But otherwise, I think there's a ton of cool things that you can get from the Patreon and the YouTube channel membership. But the most important is, of course, getting to hang out with some amazing people in the Discord and the guarantee that you get any of your suggested cards turned into videos for the channel eventually. It might take me a while, but I will get to them. I think everyone who is a patron or channel member has had at least one card suggested that has been turned into a video. So if you're interested in joining these amazing people, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard, then please do check us out. But I think I've rambled on enough, so let's look at our opponents for this week and test out our deck in a game. So this week is going to be a bit of a unique game because we are running in an all Super Friends game. Every single player at this table is playing a Super Friends deck, and all of them are built very differently, which I think is a ton of fun. So starting off, we have Richard playing Esika, God of the Tree. We have Doodle playing Will and Rowan Kenrith. And then we have Bilal playing Amarith the Lustrous. So starting off with Richard and his Esika deck, obviously Esika on the front side wants to tap for mana for legendary creatures, but the big thing here is actually the back side, which is the Prismatic Bridge, because he can get creatures or planeswalkers for free off the top of his deck every single turn. But Richard mentioned that he knows the power of the Prismatic Bridge, and most other people also know the power of the Prismatic Bridge, so he wanted to handicap his building just a little bit. So he built something that he calls the Teen Titans. Essentially, every single planeswalker, with one exception, in the deck is 3 mana or less. So he has no planeswalkers, again, with only one exception, that cost more than 3 mana. So he really wants to build around the small planeswalkers, the Teen Titans, but all Teen Titans have to have a mentor of sorts, which is where the one non-3 mana planeswalker comes in. So I am very excited for this. Richard is in our Discord kind of the Superfriends expert. I think he definitely has more Superfriends decks than anyone I personally know. I'm sure he could probably let you know more about it if you're interested, but definitely the person that I went to when I was building this deck when I needed a little bit of advice in what to do. So I'm very nervous. I do think Richard is our biggest threat at the table. But moving on to Doodle and his Kenrith Twins deck, this one I am very excited for. I'm a huge fan of Will and Rowan Kenrith, and I think that the two of them combined really play well in a Super Friends deck, because while Will's ultimate allows you to copy your instants and sorceries, which is not really what you want to be doing, his -2 ability lets you cast your planeswalkers for cheaper, and then once you cast Rowan, she's able to, hopefully, eventually, get to her -8, where you can copy the ability of any ability you activate that isn't a mana ability, which does include planeswalkers. So this is kind of a unique build. You typically don't see Izzet planeswalkers. I think that more often than not, if a color for planeswalkers tends to be forgotten, it's usually red, just because Atraxa is one of the big go-tos for planeswalker decks. So I'm very interested to see what Doodle can do with this. And like I said, I just love Will and Rowan. I think they're great. And then finally, got to talk about Bilal's Amarith deck. Now, when we started talking about playing an all planeswalker deck pod, I wasn't expecting Bilal to pull out Amarith. I was expecting him to pull out Carth the Lion, which we talked about earlier. So I was very surprised when he suggested that he play Amarith. And this is a card that I've seen a couple of times in the past, but I've never really gotten a chance to see it with Super Friends, which I think means that it's going to be a very unique take on the build, because one, it's in the Bant colors, which is also kind of a rare color combination for Super Friends, but it also really draws a bunch of cards, because Amarith lets you look at the top card of your library when a permanent enters under your control, and then put it into your hand if it shares a card type with it. So if he can keep hitting planeswalkers by playing planeswalkers, he can kind of just keep drawing more and more cards and never run out of action. Plus, more so than anyone else at the table, he actually has a win condition in his command zone. Having a 6/6 flying commander is definitely something that can close out games, while the rest of us essentially have non-damaging commanders. I mean, I guess Esika could technically win with commander damage, but I feel like if Esika's winning with commander damage, Richard has probably done something wrong along the way, so definitely very interested to see the Amarith build. But those are our opponents for this week, so please do let me know down in the comments how you think this game is going to go. Get your predictions in. I always love seeing what people think is going to happen versus their thoughts once it's actually done. So thank you all so much for listening to the Deck Tech. I hope you did enjoy it. And now let's jump into the game. Hopefully you enjoy that as well. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Richard goes first, followed by Doodle, myself, and then Bilal. On Richard's first turn, he plays a Ziatora's Proving Ground. Doodle plays a Storm-Carved Coast. I play a Path of Ancestry. Bilal plays a Temple of Enlightenment, scrying 1. Richard plays a Command Tower and casts 3 visits, searching his library for a Ketria Triome, putting it into play. Doodle plays a Mountain and casts Tybalt the Fiend-Blooded. I play a Plains and cast Heart of Kiran. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Temple of Plenty, scrying 1. Richard plays an Interplanar Beacon, then casts Whirlwind of Thought, letting him draw a card whenever he casts a non-creature spell. Doodle plays an Island and casts Gloin Dwarf Emissary, letting him make a treasure token once per turn when he casts a historic spell. He then activates Tybalt's +1 ability, drawing a card and discarding a card at random. Unfortunately, on my turn, I miss my 3rd land drop and pass. On Bilal's turn, he also misses his 3rd land, but he casts an Arcane Signet to make up for it. Richard plays a Deathcap Glade, then casts Liliana the Last Hope, drawing a card and gaining a life. He activates Liliana's +1 ability, giving Gloin -2/-1 until his next turn. Doodle plays a Grixis Panorama, then casts Teferi Master of Time, making a treasure and activating his +1 ability to draw a card and discard a card. He also activates Tybalt's +1 ability, drawing a card and then discarding a card at random, then attacks Liliana for 1 with Gloin. On my turn, I play a Command Tower and cast Oath of Gideon, making 2 1/1 core ally tokens when it enters, and also allowing my planeswalkers to enter with an additional loyalty counter. At the end of turn, Doodle activates Teferi's +1 ability, drawing a card and then discarding a card. Bilal plays a Forest and casts Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. In response, Doodle activates Teferi's +1 ability again, drawing a card and discarding a card. Richard casts Saheeli Sublime Artificer, drawing a card, gaining a life, and letting him make a 1/1 servo token whenever he casts a non-creature spell. He then casts the Elder Spell, drawing a card, making a servo, and destroying any number of planeswalkers, destroying Teferi and Tybalt, then putting 2 loyalty counters on another planeswalker for each planeswalker destroyed, putting 4 counters on Liliana. In response, Doodle activates Teferi's +1 ability to draw a card and discard a card, then the Elder Spell resolves. This allows Richard to activate Liliana's -7 ability, killing the planeswalker and getting an emblem that makes X +2 zombies in his end step, where X is the number of zombies he controls. He then moves to his end step, making 2 zombies. Doodle plays a Sulphur Falls and casts Jin-Gitaxias, letting him draw a card whenever he casts a spell with mana value 3 or greater. This also makes him a treasure token with Gloin. On my turn, I play a Mountain, then cast Chandra Torch of Defiance, activating her +1 ability to exile the top card of my library, being able to cast it this turn, but since it's a Kaya Ghost Hunter, I can't, and instead each of my opponents take 2 damage. Then I remove a loyalty counter from Chandra to crew the Heart of Kiran, and use it to attack Saheeli for 4. Bilal plays an island and casts his commander, Amarith the Lustrous, letting him look at the top card of his library whenever a permanent enters under his control, putting it into his hand if it shares a permanent type with it. Richard plays a Verdant Catacombs, sacrificing it to lose a life and search his library for a swamp, putting it into play, then casts Dovin Hand of Control, drawing a card, gaining a life, making a servo, and making all artifacts, instants, and sorceries his opponents control cost 1 more. He activates Dovin's -1 ability, preventing all damage that would be dealt to or by Heart of Kiran until Richard's next turn. Then he casts Liliana of the Veil, drawing a card, gaining a life, and making a servo. He immediately activates her -2 ability to make Bilal sacrifice a creature, killing his commander. This lets him move to combat and attack Bilal for 5 with a servo and 2 zombies. Then, at the end of turn, Richard makes 4 more zombie tokens. Doodle casts his commander, Will Kenrith, drawing a card and making a treasure, then activates Will's +2 ability to turn 2 of Richard's zombies into 0/3 creatures with no abilities until Doodle's next turn. Then he also casts Thrumming Bird, which lets him proliferate when it deals combat damage to a player. On my turn, I activate Chandra's +1 ability, making 2 red mana, using it to cast Oath of Teferi, letting me activate my planeswalkers twice on each of my turns, and also exiling Oath of Gideon, returning it to play at the end of turn. Then I activate Chandra's +1 ability again, making 2 more mana, but I can't do anything with it, so in my end step, Oath of Gideon returns to play and makes me 2 more core ally tokens. Bilal casts Dream Trawler, which gets +1/+0 for each card he's drawn this turn, and also lets him discard a card to tap it and give it hexproof until the end of turn. Richard plays a Mountain and casts Flux Channeler, letting him proliferate whenever he casts a non-creature spell. Then he cast Rowan's Talent, enchanting Saheeli, proliferating, drawing a card, making a servo, and giving Saheeli a +1 ability that gives target creature +2/+0, first strike, and trample until the end of turn, and also lets Richard copy any of Saheeli's loyalty abilities when they're activated. After that resolves, he activates Saheeli's new +1 ability, copying it to give 2 of his zombies +2/+0, first strike, and trample until the end of turn. He attacks Chandra for 11 with 3 servos and his 2 buffed zombies, and before blocks, I remove a loyalty counter from Chandra to crew a Heart of Kiran, using it to block and kill a servo, then Chandra still takes 10 and dies. At the end of turn, Richard makes 8 more zombie tokens. Doodle plays a Surtland Frostpire, then activates Will's -2 ability, drawing 2 cards and making his instant sorceries and planeswalkers cost 2 less to cast until his next turn, and this lets him cast his other commander, Rowan Kenrith, making a treasure and drawing a card. He activates Rowan's +2 ability, making all of Bilal's creatures attack on his next turn if able, then attacks Richard for 1 with Thrumming Bird, proliferating when it deals combat damage. On my turn, I play a Gond Gate, letting my gates enter the battlefield untapped, then cast Jeru with Eyes Open, preventing 1 damage to my planeswalkers whenever they're dealt damage, and also letting me search my library for a planeswalker, in this case Jace Cunning Castaway, putting it into my hand. Bilal attacks Saheeli with Dream Trawler, drawing a card on attacks, doing 5 damage, killing the planeswalker and letting Bilal gain 5 life. Then in his second main phase, he casts Lae'zel, Vlaakith's champion, letting him put an extra counter on his creatures or planeswalkers whenever they would get a counter. Richard cast Grist the Hungertide, drawing a card, gaining a life and proliferating, then cast Elspeth's Talent, enchanting Liliana, drawing a card, proliferating, and giving Liliana a +1 ability to create 3 1/1 soldier tokens, and also giving all his creatures +2/+2 in vigilance whenever her loyalty abilities are activated. He then plays a Flooded Strand, and activates Liliana's +1 ability, making 3 soldier tokens and giving all his creatures +2/+2 in vigilance. This lets him attack Doodle with all his tokens for 69 total damage, knocking him out of the game. Then in his second main phase, Richard activates Grist's -2 ability, sacrificing a soldier to destroy Dream Trawler, but Bilal discards a card to give it hexproof, saving it. At the end of turn, Richard makes 15 more zombie tokens and also sacrifices his Flooded Strand, losing a life and searching his library for a Jetmir's Garden, putting it into play. He also remembers to activate Dovin's -1 ability, preventing all damage that would be done by or to the Heart of Kiran. On my turn, I cast Gideon of the Trials, activating his 0 ability twice to make 2 emblems that prevent me from losing the game as long as I control a Gideon planeswalker. At the end of turn, Bilal flashes in Errant and Giada, letting him look at the top card of his library at any time and cast it if it's a creature with flying or flash. On Bilal's turn, he casts Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, activating his +1 ability to draw a card and untap 2 lands in his end step. He then attacks Liliana with Dream Trawler, drawing a card when it attacks, hitting the planeswalker for 6, killing her and letting Bilal gain 6 life. On Richard's turn, he casts Teferi Time Raveler, forcing his opponents to cast spells only at sorcery speed, drawing a card, proliferating, and gaining a life. He activates Grist's -2 ability, sacrificing a soldier to destroy Bilal's Teferi. Once that resolves, he casts his own Oath of Teferi, exiling Grist, returning it to play at the end of turn, gaining the ability to activate his planeswalkers twice a turn, drawing a card, and proliferating. He then activates Teferi's -2 ability, returning Lae'zel to Bilal's hand, and this allows him to attack Bilal with all his tokens for 59 total damage, knocking him out of the game. In his second main phase, Richard plays an Exotic Orchard, and at the end of turn, Grist returns to play while he makes 29 more zombies. On my turn, I cast Jace Cunning Castaway, and since he enters with an additional loyalty counter and I can activate him twice a turn, I'm able to activate his +1 ability, letting me draw a card and discard a card when I deal combat damage to a player with a creature, then immediately activate his -5 ability, killing Jace but making 2 token copies of him that aren't legendary. I'm then able to repeat this process an infinite number of times to make an infinite number of Jaces, and once that happens, I can activate the infinite Jace's -2 abilities to make an infinite number of 2/2 illusion tokens. Unfortunately, they don't have haste though, so I do pass the turn. On Richard's turn, he casts Search for Glory, searching his library for a snow permanent, legend, or saga, choosing Urza's Ruinous Blast, putting it into his hand, also drawing a card and proliferating. He activates Grist's -2 ability, sacrificing a soldier to destroy Gideon of the Trials, then casts Talisman of Unity, drawing a card and proliferating, and finally cast Urza's Ruinous Blast, exiling all non-legendary, non-land permanents, which includes my infinite Jaces and infinite illusions, as well as all of Richard's zombies, while he draws another card and proliferates. After that, he plays a Forest, and activates Teferi's -2 ability, returning my Oath of Teferi to my hand. He activates Grist's +1 ability, milling a card and making a 1/1 insect token. He activates Dovin's +1 ability, preventing all damage that would be dealt to or by Heart of Kirin until Richard's next turn. Then at the end of turn, he makes 2 zombie tokens. On my turn, I cast Toothy Imaginary Friend, searching my library for his partner, Peer Imaginative Rascal, putting him into my hand. Richard casts Sarkhan the Masterless, gaining a life, casts Ren and Realmbreaker, gaining a life, and casts Teo the Shield Mage, gaining a life. He then activates Sarkhan's +1 ability, turning all his planeswalkers into 4/4 dragons until the end of turn. At this point, I realize there's no way for me to get out of this situation, so rather than make Richard take me out over the course of a few turns, I decide to concede, winning Richard the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot happening in that game, and I'm going to be perfectly honest, when Bilal and I both missed our 3rd land drops, I really thought the game was just kind of over, especially considering that Richard was able to get off that Elder Spell, Ultimate Liliana, and just start making zombies every single turn. I really thought this was going to be a super short game, and we were able to claw our way back into it. In fact, everybody really was. Doodle got a little bit unlucky not finding a ton of ways to really protect his planeswalkers. He had a ton of ways to force people to attack, and especially point them at other people, but once it came down to actually defending from attackers, he couldn't quite find things that mattered. Bilal also did very well, but unfortunately just kind of tried to drop one big creature after another onto the board, which kept getting destroyed or sacrificed, and it didn't quite work out for him. So I think that if he'd been able to get a couple of smaller creatures in play earlier, I think that he'd be able to protect his bigger threats, but the draw just wasn't there for him this time, so a little bit unfortunate. And then for us, we did what the deck wanted to do. We made an infinite number of Jaces, and then we made an infinite number of illusions, and then because they didn't have haste, we still died anyway. And honestly, that's probably one of my more fun ways to have lost in a game of Commander. And you didn't get to see it in the actual video, but there was a point when I had no idea that I could combo with Jace. On the turn that I was casting him, I was just like, we'll put Jace out there, maybe I can +1, maybe I can draw a card, or maybe I have to make an illusion. And then Bilal pointed out that I actually did have an infinite combo in play, which I felt a little bit bad about because it was known information. It was stuff that we all could have seen, and I had convinced Richard to kill Bilal the previous turn instead of me, so I had made the decision to not actually go for the infinite combo because I felt bad that I had not lied necessarily, but I hadn't paid attention to what I was doing, so I had almost tricked Richard into doing what I wanted, and I didn't want to win a game that way. But he gave me the go-ahead. He said that he wanted to see if he could get a way out of it because he had the tutor in his hand, And so we went ahead and did the thing. We made the infinite Jaces and the infinite illusions, and then you saw Richard tutored up a non-legendary board wipe, which was actually perfect in that scenario because all of our Jaces were non-legendary, and he was able to kind of get his way back into it and just start running us back over with planeswalkers and zombies. So it was very, very cool to see, and like I said, losing in that situation is never a bad thing. I did have an intention of, if I'd survived for a turn, I was going to plus all of the infinite Jaces and probably just hit Richard with a single creature to deck myself because, like I said, I didn't really want to win with all of the tokens. It felt kind of cheaty, so let me know what you think down in the comments, if you think that that's something that would have been okay, or if you would have done the same thing in that situation, because it was a very weird situation. But like I said, I didn't want to make everyone at the table believe that I was not going to win and then kind of trick them into winning. That's not what I want to be doing. So let me know what you think down in the comments. But otherwise, everyone's deck did super well. We didn't really talk about Richard's, but I mean, an early Liliana emblem just kind of sealed the deal for everybody. It's tough to come back from that, especially when he started making like 10, 20, 30 zombies every single turn. We were just kind of out of luck with all of our planeswalkers. So a very good showing. I'm glad to see that the Teen Titans won the day. Obviously, they're the heroes, right? So they should win. And then also very cool that the Super Friends master of our play group did wind up being the winner of the Super Friends pod because, you know, I wouldn't expect anything else. So thank you all so much for watching. Like I said earlier, please do let me know down in the comments what you thought of the game. Let me know what you thought of the deck. Let me know if you have any suggestions for future videos or future cards you would like to see built around. And as always, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate everyone who sticks around and participates in the videos and the comments. I love the little community that we've created. So thank you all so much for helping us get to this point. But I think with all of that being said, once again, thank you so much, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.